I'm going to refinish this old dresser. Plan is to bleach it so that it goes better with our decor. Is that what we're gonna do? Yeah.
I used this Rio dresser from Crate & Barrel as my inspiration for how I wanted my finished dresser to look.
The plan is to do a little bit every day because my hands are full, but I think within a week or so I can get it done. Let's see.
First, I went over the entire dresser with 60 grit sandpaper using an orbital sander. I had to remove all of the hardware so I could sand all of the sides and edges. I made sure to take a picture of how the hardware looked before removing it because I didn't want to have any problems adding it back on after. In the future, I think I will start with an 80 or 100 grit for the first sand because 60 was a little aggressive around the intricate parts like the curved edges. Once I sanded everything with a 60 grit, I went over all of it again with a 220 grit to make it a nice and smooth finish. The sanding took me at least 3 or 4 days. I lost track of count, but I was also doing a little bit at a time. I never really had a full day to work on it. Some people use a stripper to take off the stain, and I might try that next time to see if it makes it any easier. Once I was done with all the sanding, I wiped everything with a tack cloth to make sure it was all dust-free before I started bleaching. When I did my research, I noticed some people used household bleach, and I decided to give it a try, but it didn't really work for me. I applied it twice, and I didn't notice any color change once it dried. I considered buying wood bleach, but I decided to go with a Minwax Pickled Oak stain instead. Again, I didn't notice a huge difference after staining the dresser, but it did give it a more rich, natural wood color. After staining, I sealed it using a Minwax Polyacrlylic top coat. Sorry, I forgot to film that part. Sorry, I forgot to film this part because it was taking me forever and I forgot. But this is the sealer that I used. It's the polyacrylic, and this is the brush I put it on with. I waited for it to dry, I sanded it with a fine grit sandpaper, and then I did a second coat. Again, after it dried, I sanded it with a fine grit sandpaper to get a smooth finish. Now to the drawers. I took out the old hardware and purchased 1/4-inch dowels to fill in the holes. Then I went over the crevices with wood filler and sanded it down once it dried. Then I marked and drilled the holes for the new hardware which I purchased on Amazon. I made sure to pre-drill the holes before painting to avoid getting any chips in my paint. There were a couple of dark knots on 2 of the drawers which I spot painted using a shellac sealer and sanded. Again, sorry I forgot to film that part. I did this because I read that knots tend to show through if you don't do that, and I didn't want to take any chances. Once the shellac sealer dried, I sanded it with the 220 grit sandpaper. Then I did 3 coats of Benjamin Moore's Chantilly lace white paint, and I sealed the drawers with the Minwax Polyacrylic top coat as well. I read that using polyacrylic on white paint will prevent yellowing over time as opposed to using polyurethane. I hope that's true. I did 2 coats of the polyacrylic and hand sanded with an extra fine grit sandpaper in between the coats. Once it all dried, I screwed in the handles and added all of the hardware back on.
What do you think of the new dresser? It took us way longer than 1 week, didn't it?
The new dresser looks so much better in our bedroom. It really goes with the modern look that I'm trying to create, but I still have a lot of work to do in this room. The finer edges like the curved details on the drawers are far from perfect, but for my first project, I'm pretty happy overall. Here's my dresser next to the inspirational photo.